What is executive presence, or better yet, charisma? Is it something that you can learn, or do you have to be born with it? We've all seen those individuals who've walked into a room or take the stage, and we look at them in admiration and say, man, I would love to be more like them. Well, can you? How do I do it? Well, that's what we're answering today on today's episode of You're in Charge, the podcast where we meet each week to answer questions just like this to help you become the leader that you want, whether you're brand new to leadership or an experienced leader who's just trying to refine their skills. Well, today's guest, Richard Reid, has been helping individuals and corporations for the past 20 plus years answering this question, helping them both from a mental aspect of helping them be comfortable with who they are, and then also working on their outward skills, as he says, to polish the edges to help you stand out, become more the person that you want in order to become the leader that you want. So I'm very excited. It's a great conversation. I can't wait for us to go. So let's dive into today's episode with our guest, Richard Reid. Richard, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited about this conversation because as we talked offline, the goal of this channel is to help newer managers or even experienced managers get better. And when your team reached out, the topic that struck me is this idea of executive presence or charisma. Why do we look at someone who walks into a room and we go, oh, they're charismatic, or they're a leader, or someone just takes control? And the more I research what you do, you help people develop that, where I think a lot of people think it's just natural born. So on that topic, and then I want to get into your story, how you ended up in this position, but this idea of presence or charisma, is it something that you can teach?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on today. Really good to be here. But in answer to your question, absolutely. So I've been teaching this stuff for years, and it all has a psychological underpinning to it. And whilst it's fair to say some people are born with more charisma and presence than others, we can all move further along that continuum. So I teach the skills that help people to do that. And people tend to think it's about outward behaviours, and to some extent it is, but it starts with how you manage your internal world. If you're not aware and in command of your emotions, then you'll be doing all kinds of weird and wonderful things in terms of how you manifest to the outside world. So that's where it starts.
So on that, there was an article that you wrote, and one of the lines really struck me. You said a leader really has to, on your point, manage their emotions. People who are not aware of that come to the table and use their one emotion, whatever that is, in every situation, be it standing in front of a team, one-on-one, and your point was you have to bring a different emotion to each of these events. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So I guess if we're not aware of what we're carrying and we're not able to apply skills to manage that, it's very haphazard. So we can be very inconsistent in terms of how we turn up to situations. We can be triggered by certain things that maybe we hadn't anticipated, or we can bring what we call emotional leakage. So I may have had a very difficult conversation just beforehand, and I now need to be fully present. I need to be very empathic, for example. But if I'm bringing all this other emotion with me, then it may be I cut in before you're ready. It may be I'm very quick to jump in and make assumptions about what it is you're saying. So it can work against me. So being in command of these things is really, really important. And when we're in command of our emotions, it's almost like we have spare capacity to think about what the situation warrants. If I'm overwhelmed by my own emotions and I'm not aware of that or have the capacity to influence that, I'm not going to be aware of what's happening in real time. I'm going to start to objectify you rather than see you in a dynamic way and to adapt my message accordingly. So this is really, really important that we have that spare capacity to adapt to what the situation brings. And I often use the analogy of a tradesperson. A tradesperson turning up to every job, assuming the same tool is going to work in every job. And it will work sometimes, but sometimes it will go drastically wrong. And this is what tends to happen when we're not emotionally intelligent. So this is where the kind of thing that I teach comes into play.
So if someone's sitting there listening right now, and I'm sure someone in the audience is going, that sounds great, and I wish I could, or I work with someone who does that. But for the managers who are trying to grow, what is something that they could do from a tactical standpoint? Like I love your example of, I just came out of a meeting, and this happens a lot. It's the idea of, I just got chewed out by somebody. And so it
Mhm.
runs downhill. I'm taking it out on
Exactly.
someone else. And or, or I'm very happy and it's a great time, but I'm not picking up that something's wrong. Is there a technique or something that gives them that pause, or something they should do to, basically take a breath? How do they handle that?
Yeah, yeah, it's a good question. A lot of the people that I work with, they've got incredibly busy lives already. So, you can come up with all kinds of fantastic interventions that they can start to apply. But in reality, most people will see that as an added pressure. When we're under pressure, we revert back to what we know best. So,
Mm-hmm.
what I tend to teach people is things around what I call transitions. So, in other words, maybe I'm going from one activity or meeting to another, and maybe I've only got a few seconds or a couple of minutes. How can I use that time as effectively as possible to make sure that I maximize my opportunity in that next situation? So going back to the point that you made in your question, some of it is actually about how we manage our breath.
Hmm.
So breathing is a good indication of how we're feeling, and managing that can feed back into our perception and our behavior. So even if we've only got 30 seconds, managing our breathing, slowing it down and doing what we call 4-4-6 breathing, breathing out for slightly longer than we breathe in, allows us to start to influence how the brain behaves. And other things that we can do as well is to focus on our peripheral vision. When we get stressed or very, very busy, we tend to tighten up around the shoulders and the neck, and to
Mm.
look at what's immediately in front of us. So
Right.
even just looking around us for a moment, noticing our feet, simple as those things seem, they actually start to reverse the stress responses of the brain and the body. And it allows us to have that spare capacity to be emotionally intelligent. And what we can then start to do is to, at the very least, even if we're not fully placating whatever those unhelpful emotions might be, allows us to be aware of them and to be tread more carefully in that next situation. So if I know that I'm stressed, I might make a deliberate intention to speak more slowly in that next
Right.
meeting to account for that. But also what I might do is think, what does this situation require? So quite often we're very focused upon the words that we use, but not the emotion that goes with them. And actually, as human beings, we do have a rational part of the brain that responds to the content of messages. But first and foremost, we're animals. And we respond to the way in which those messages are delivered in terms of body language, in terms of voice, and the energy that goes with it. So deciding on the energy that we want to bring to a situation also allows us to be more informed about whether we go with the prevailing emotion that we have, or whether we do something to adapt it. And it's really, really important. Some of the most charismatic people can often be extroverts. They don't
Mm-hmm.
have to be extroverts, but they can be extroverts. And extroverts tend to be high energy. And
Right.
if you think about that when you're coming into contact with somebody who's extremely introverted, introverts tend to want more time to process their thoughts
Mm-hmm.
before they share them externally. So an extrovert can be very quick. They can think out loud, and it creates a clash in terms of the communication styles. So setting the intention to be calmer, to be slower, allows other people the space to really express themselves, for us to be more aligned with them, and for them to feel heard. And that really sort of builds rapport. So this is why it's important not just to assume that just because our energy works in lots of other situations, that it's going to work here. And also we can adapt it dynamically as well. If it's not quite hitting the mark, we can adapt in real time if we've got that spare capacity.
I love that idea, and you've said it a few times. And for the audience, I hope you're picking up on that. That idea of capacity, having a little space,
Mm.
where if I come from a high energy meeting or a frustrating meeting or whatever, where you are laser focused and you are tense and you're breathing and
Mm.
it's taking that technique to be able to say, one, breathing, I have to let it go. But from what I'm hearing, and I like that, is, where am I going next, and what is this situation, and what energy do I have to bring, and who is in there? Because if I did come from a meeting with a lot of high energy extroverts, like salespeople who are all like,
Mm.
and now I have to go address someone or a team that's not built that way, I have to dial myself down, or else that message is not going to be received. They're so overwhelmed, they stop hearing you. And so
Yeah.
that's a fascinating way, because I think a lot of us take it for granted if we're good at it, perceptive. But that idea of space, It's an interesting thing. You wrote an
Absolutely.
article, something that said, talked about this idea of a blank canvas, of either building out, I took it two ways. One is myself. What do I want to be in this situation? Or more importantly, understanding the situation and that team and, you know, that situation that I'm walking into. Can you explain this idea? Because I like your articles. They use a lot of analogies and imagery, and that works for me. So talk about the blank canvas.
Yeah, so I guess a lot of the time when we go into interactions, we have a script as to how that situation is going to run.
Mm-hmm.
And the risk with that, particularly when we're operating at pace and under pressure, is that we operate in what's called system one of the brain, and that tends to see people either as conduits for what we want to achieve or blockers. And as a consequence, we're not meeting people where they are. We're not understanding what's motivating their position. We're not working on alignment. And this idea of the blank canvas, it originally comes from, it's quite an eclectic one. It comes from German philosophy. So there's a guy called Martin Buber.
Mm-hmm.
And Martin Buber talks about this idea of I and thou. And I and thou is when we meet and we meet in an authentic way and we create something between us. In other words, I'm not coming with something that's already created.
Mm-hmm.
I'm working with you and creating something fresh and new and exciting. And that's really what this is about. It's about having that spare capacity, as we've already said, to be fully present, to notice the dynamics that are going on, to ask questions and show curiosity for somebody's position. And as a consequence, be able to hopefully create that alignment, or at the very least, even if we've still got a differing standpoint, that we're coming at it from a respectful point of view. But it's interesting when we come at this with a fresh pair of eyes, how often we can create something really exciting.
And that ties into that idea. There was another piece that you talked about, which was true leaders or people who are very comfortable in themselves have that presence, that extra capacity. It allows you to have silence and listen, right?
Yeah.
And I think you just touched on that, where it's if I'm coming to a situation or a collaboration or a meeting, whatever, a discussion, and I'm comfortable in myself, I don't have to prove something to you, or I'm not coming with a preset agenda to say, and I liked your idea, you're either, you're a conduit or you're a blocker. But this idea of I can listen and I'm comfortable enough to allow silence to happen. Is silence for people who've worked with you, like once they get through to the other side, is it because now they're comfortable in their emotion, they understand themselves, they have built all of these tools where they can listen? Or is it just, to your point, is I'm approaching it being respectful, so I will listen?
I think the latter point is probably where it starts off, but over time, the idea is that they develop the skills to feel comfortable and to be flexible. So it's not a case of I do that in a very rote kind of way. I bring to bear the skills that are relevant for the situation. And as you get more adept at this, you can even look at the body cues from the other person. So that the eyes, the lips, the movement of the tongue, all these things that give you an indication when somebody's still developing an idea and they need that extra time. So you become more skilled with it the more that you use. But as human beings, we tend to have this view, particularly when we're new in a role and we're sort of working our way through the ranks, that we have to justify our existence based on what we outwardly appear to do. So in other words, sometimes saying something for the sake of saying something. And clearly we need to be adding value at some point in that manner. But the people with the most presence tend to be very deliberate and purposeful in what they say and do in terms of how they move, in terms of if and when they say something. And as a consequence, people tend to notice that and they give it more attention. So this person doesn't speak all the time, but when they do, it's really got value behind it. So I'm going to listen to this person. And it's really a leap of faith. For people who don't buy the strategy, it can be quite scary to start off with, but it's something to experiment with. And the more that you do it, and the more that you see the positive ramifications of that, the more likely you are to engage with it on a regular basis.
See, what I love about that, especially for, people who are audience of this podcast, who are management or new managers, especially this idea of what you just said, which is really important, is the fact that as a new manager, I feel I have to have all the answers, or I have to constantly be talking, and I have to constantly, I can't, if I stop for silence, they're misinterpreting it, in my opinion, is they think, oh, that person doesn't know what they're talking about. So that's why they're not talking. And so there's nerves attached to, As you said, how someone we think they perceive our value is how much we talk versus talk when you have to talk about value. So for someone who's new to management, how do you help them through that? What would be a tip is it just simple enough to be confident in who you are and listen and respond? And how do you stop them from talking and being nervous?
Yeah, it's a good point. But I think there are things you can do in those actual situations. I can talk about that in a moment. But I think there's a bigger piece of work here. And I think it's something that I notice affects people at every level. It's this idea of imposter syndrome. Even people who are very, very capable with years of experience behind them, often have this fear they're going to get the tap on the shoulder that says, you don't know what you're doing.
Right.
You're not good enough. And so there are a series of things that I work with on people, with people on around how we can start to build our inner core. So actually we develop our own confidence in our ability. And it's not all about trying to justify that to other people. So the only person we need to justify it to is ourselves. And the rest follows on from that. So again, it's about managing your internal world. So think about generally most people, they're quite dismissive of their achievements. And when they get a compliment, they tend to downplay it. But they're very receptive to criticism. And for me, there's an imbalance there. We have to acknowledge both parts. And sometimes, even if we feel uncomfortable with a compliment, learning to accept it at face value helps to, over time, dispel that. But the other things we can do are to reflect on our own experiences over the course of a day. So one of the things that I do and that I teach a lot of my clients is this idea of reflecting back on your day. How have you added value to situations? What is it that you've brought that is in some way had an influence or a bearing on that situation? How is it that you've moved things forwards, even on long-term projects that might be quite slow? This sign of progress, learning, development, adding value, so that when you're going into those ad hoc situations, you've got a stronger sense of who you are. You don't feel such a pressure to outwardly validate that with other people.
I like that, because I was guilty of that early on in my career. Not that tell me compliments, but it had this idea of false humility, or, well, if I say, oh yeah, I'm great, that's the wrong message. But I think to your point it's just as harmful, one, to the person who is giving you the compliment, that you're dismissing their compliment, which affects them, instead of just saying thank you and leaving it at that. Right. That's the way I was taught. Someone just said, just say thank you and move on. They don't want to hear more about it, because it's sometimes is uncomfortable to give someone else a compliment, because you don't know how they're going to receive it. So just be grateful. Thank you. I love that point. So let's take a step back here for you. Is that in my research of your career, started out as a, consultant, and then all of a sudden now we're over, here helping individuals. How did that journey happen, where from corporate environments to this, which brings you back to corporate environments, but in a completely different manner?
It's quite a labyrinthine way, I have to say. So at university, I studied classics, so ancient Greek and Latin. Then I was going to go into the army, so I got accepted for a place at officer training and didn't go, and went into IT consultancy. Don't ask me why. That's what I did. And to be honest, the bit of that job that I enjoyed the most was the translation. It rather than the technical side of it, it was really explaining some of those sort of techie ideas to the average employee. How does this relate to me? And so as part of that, having to adapt the message to align and understand what was going on for other people, what they needed. And that was the bit that I enjoyed. And what happened was I decided to take a year out from that to reflect on what I wanted to do longer term as a career. And I went traveling around the world. And as part of that, towards the end of that trip, I was in Patagonia in Argentina and shared a tent with a guy from Wales who was a psychiatrist. And we were talking about what we were doing there. I think he just got divorced and was figuring out the next part of his life. And I was saying, well, I'm trying to figure out my career. He said, well, have you ever thought about being a psychotherapist? I think you'd be pretty good at it. And he told me a bit about it. And when I got back to the UK, I researched it and started doing evening classes, weekend classes, and gradually working my way up in that career while still working as a consultant, and eventually made that transition to being a therapist full time. And I was working in the part of London called Mayfair. Mayfair is quite an affluent part of London, lots of hedge fund managers, lots of independently wealthy people who were coming to me with some of these kinds of issues that we've spoken about. And a lot of them would then start to introduce me into their organizations or to their contacts and saying, well, you should speak to this guy.
Right.
He's got a company and they've got a real challenge with this. And really, that's where this really snowballed and took on a bit of a life of its own, really.
I love that, because it is that idea of helping people. And I think early on, listening to you saying, taking technical and making it adaptable to the person, I think that's key. And I think that is sometimes I don't want to say a fault of managers. As we said earlier on, before we started taping, I see a lot of frontline training for individuals, be it sales teams or front. But once somebody starts going up the management chain, there is really a lack of training for those individuals. They assume because you have talent at a skill that, well, you could lead a team of those people. And leading people, to your point, it has its own issues, especially the imposter syndrome, or I'm new, or managing people who are older than me, managing people that are more experienced than me. How do I do this? So why in your, they're sending them to you, or you going into these organizations, why do you feel there is such a lack of training for management when I think they're one of the most important people, because they're leading, or they have such an impact downstream? Why is there such a disconnect on this, or just very little credence given to this by the overall leadership of the organization?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is indicative of the terminology that is used around these kind of things. People talk about soft skills. There's nothing soft about this at all.
No.
It's intrinsic, and particularly in the age of AI, where more and more there are things that can be automated for us. These are the things that are going to make us stand out and give us the versatility to do bigger and better things. So it is something that people need to think about, and it's also a differentiator. If you're in a very crowded market in terms of attracting clients and in terms of attracting the best people, they want to work in environments where they feel able to flourish.
Right.
We're not in Victorian times now. It's not just about holding down a job. People want their jobs to align with how they live their lives in other parts of their life. So getting aligned with these things is really important. It's a fact that mental health issues, for example, are on the rise. So creating what I call psychologically safe environments where people feel able to express themselves, both in terms of difficulties and in terms of innovation, is massive in terms of giving us a competitive edge.
Yeah, I think, and I loved what you just said. It's that idea of investing and giving a place to flourish. But I still run across people, leadership, when I'm brought in to talk to organizations, where they think that doesn't matter. Those soft skills. I don't have time for that. I think it's all, hogwash. That doesn't work. And I think for me, I see it's a combination of, well, I brought in Richard, but then they don't know how to implement it afterwards. They just think that putting them in a classroom, talking to you for one time,
tick the box. Yeah,
tick the box, and all of a sudden it's going to solve all of our problems. But I think, to your point, is everyone wants to flourish. They want a roadmap, but they need assistance along the way. Every time I move into a new, I want to take on a new sport, right? You travel a lot. I want to go to a certain country. I have to research. I have to know, or else the experience isn't going to be successful. Yeah. And if I'm just going to put someone in a position without investing time or resources in them to help them flourish, well, I can't be upset with them for failing. But we see that it's an amazing thing.
Yeah, you can take a healthy plant, and if you put it in the wrong environment, it's not going to flourish.
Right.
And for me, it's exactly that. A lot of organisations come to me with requests for work, and I turn them down because that's a tick box exercise. We want to, we've got a toxic environment, and we think we're going to fix it by running a few 1-hour workshops.
Right.
It's not going to happen. You have to have a culture around that, which is effectively the soil for the plant.
Right.
You've got to have the culture. So everybody's got to be singing from the same song sheet. Everybody's got to be fully supportive. Senior management have got to demonstrate that they take these things seriously. Otherwise, people treat them with lip service. And any behavioural change doesn't happen overnight. You're potentially training people who are in their 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. That's a lot of time of having rehearsed a particular way of operating. So. Right. to expect that to change in such a short period of time is not going to happen. So there has to be multiple touch points over a sustained period for those things to become embodied, and for people to realize that actually these are important things. They're not nice to have. We're actually being held accountable for manifesting these values and behaviors.
And I think what you said earlier about this AI, because, I work with a lot of automotive dealerships and clients where it's, 30-day cycle. Everything has to happen now, and you're winners, losers, and this AI conversation of, well, can we replace people? How do we use this? Or, oh, it's going to solve all my problems. And I still think, at least for now, and in my opinion, the foreseeable future, AI is going to be great. It's going to be a co-pilot, but we still want the human touch. And if we're not training those people or finding the right people, and we're just going to rely on this technology, you're going to lose clients. And then more importantly, as you said, and I hope the leaders who are listening to this, who run teams, when you said, it struck me, somebody who's been working for 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, they've been anchoring in a certain way of doing things, and to pivot and think that one class is going to change something. Like even your story, you had a conversation or multiple conversations with this gentleman in Patagonia, but it took time for you to develop your skills and go to school and learn this and grow and do.
Absolutely.
And it takes time. And I don't think, and I think that's where the mental health thing, which I'd like to talk a little bit about, is this pressure, because everything has to happen today, and everything has to, we're in such an instantaneous society now. And so what are you seeing when you're talking about mental health? Is that one of the main things that you're seeing, this pressure of speed that I have to deliver?
Yeah. I think that the speed and the volume of things that people contend with are definitely a factor. And I think, the lines between work life and home life have also blurred. You've got lots of people working from home. You've got lots of people with devices where they're picking up emails outside of office hours.
Right.
It's becoming harder and harder to switch off. And there's all of that blue light as well, which has a massive impact on quality of sleep and all of that sort of stuff as well. But I think for me, the biggest thing, and I think you touched on it briefly there when you're talking about sort of leadership and aims around businesses, is impulse control. Because now more than ever, we have opportunities for instant gratification. If I'm thinking something, I can fire off a text message. If I want to buy something, I can buy it right now. If I want to watch a TV program, I don't have to wait till it comes back on TV. I can watch it right now.
Right.
And all of these things in themselves, they're not bad. But if you've got an accumulation of these things, it's really pandering to that system one part of the brain, which insists everything needs to happen now. When it doesn't, it generates anxiety.
Right.
And it also generates bad decision making. Think about how often, in home life, but business life, we fire off emails in anger and then repent at leisure.
Right.
It's a false economy. We spend more time trying to pick up the pieces than if we'd done it properly the first time. And I see this in terms of how businesses approach things like mental health and changing culture. They want those instant fixes. And, in some cases there are quick fixes you can make, but for the most part, it's about behavioral change, and that takes time.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I want to, as we sort of get into the last part of this, you definitely write a lot, and I really appreciate when I started reading, and I will continue to read. I really like your writing. But you have a new book out, just came out early March as we're recording, called Charisma. And
yes,
I'd like to talk about what this book is about, and more importantly, that word charisma, again, is one of those words that people either they know it when they see it or feel it, but they don't know if I could generate it myself, or you're just born with it. So tell me about what this book is about and why you wrote it.
Okay, so the Charisma Edge, as the book's called, is really the accumulation of about 20 years of research and first-hand experience of working with people. And it's applicable to anybody, but it's primarily targeted towards business people, how you can get more win-win situations from your interactions, and how you can maximize your own personal potential. And a lot of people, when they think about charisma, they tend to either see it as being quite gimmicky and about charm and telling people what they want to hear.
Right.
Or they think it's, as you said, something that you've either got or you haven't got. And this book is really about It's about acknowledging that we're all starting in different positions with this idea, but that actually all of us can move further along that continuum using some of those psychology techniques that I've used within the therapy room as much as I have within the coaching realm.
Mm-hmm.
So it teaches people how to do that. And going back to something we touched on earlier, it all starts from how we manage our internal world. So it's not one of these sort of gimmicky self-help books where if you put your hands in this position and you use these particular words that you're going to charm the pants off somebody.
Mm-hmm.
It's about acknowledging where you are. And also what I think is key here is celebrating your uniqueness. It's not about a cookie cutter exercise where you do this, this, and this, and you're going to be an identikit of somebody else. It's yes, it's partly about polishing the edges of who you are,
right?
But it's first and foremost about accepting who you are, because that is the thing that makes you stand out. You know, and for most of us, that's what we're most afraid of. You know, that actually, what if people don't accept me for who I am?
Right.
What if I really reveal who I am to people? And charisma for me is not, you know, ideally it's about people liking you, but you can be charismatic and not likable too. And I think, you know, we don't need to name names. We can all think of a few examples of those kind of people. But it's, you know, people know what you stand for. You have a personal brand. And for me, that's key. You're not, you know, you're not vanilla. People might love or hate you, but they know what you stand for. And hopefully in most cases, they will validate and accept you for it. And I think even those people that we absolutely can't stand, there's a degree of respect that goes with knowing what people stand for.
No, and that's why I'm excited to read the book, because as I was reading about it, I said, oh, I'm fascinated with that idea. And now it's clear based on our conversation so far, it's understanding who you are and being comfortable with that. That takes, for some people, that takes a lifetime. Some people aren't happy with what they are, but I think it's important, and for listeners, what you said, I'm not trying to be you, or I'm not trying to be, you could emulate certain characteristics of someone else or someone that you admire, but you can't be them because you're you. And I think it all comes to that idea of the more I'm self-aware of who I am, and even that word has been overused, but really understanding who you are, then you can start working on some technical things to help you, as you said, smooth out the edges, present yourself. But without that knowledge, it seems like you're off to a bad start.
Absolutely. If you don't know what your foundations are, you don't know what you're building on. And I think, you know, all these added skills, and some of it might be modeling other people. It's then about integrating that within the framework of who you are. And again, that goes back to this idea of behavioral change. It doesn't happen by, you know, turning up and applying some superficial techniques. You've got to build it up over time. So we basically teach people, we coach people. We also teach people to appreciate this as a work in progress. And we give them the skills to continue that work for themselves. They effectively become their own coach. You know, even me who teaches this stuff, it's always a work in progress.
Right.
And I think some of this is about, it's not about presenting a veneer either. Going back to what we talked about before about leadership, it's also about humility and vulnerability. People also respond to vulnerability. If I come across as perfect, I'm not approachable, and also potentially not trustworthy either. We're too polished, and we see this with some politicians.
Right.
They're too polished. We don't trust them.
Right.
So being slightly unpolished, having vulnerabilities within reason is actually okay. And actually it can be inclusive. If I'm a leader and I say, well, you know, this is what I learned from that experience, or this is what I'm working through. Actually, I don't know about this. What do you think?
Right.
It elevates other people. And for me, this is a really important part of charisma. It's not just about me looking great. It's about who I bring with me. And when people feel that I'm also rooting for them and I'm bringing them with me, then you promote loyalty and you almost, you know, in effect, create that marketing team for your personal brand. People will go off and talk about you in a good way.
Right. And what I just am hearing and admire from what you're pushing out is that the journey for everyone, it never stops. Because I think also there is as much as we talked about, there's a lack of leadership training or mentoring in that middle section. I see people who are the top in their organization and no one's helping them, or they're looking around, who's going to help me?
It's lonely, isn't it? Yeah.
It is lonely, but how, you know, helping them to understand there's maybe a group outside or someone like yourself, your organization is going to say, well, I'm here to help you. And I think that's comforting to be able to say, I need, well, again, self-awareness to say, I still need help myself. So at that top level, is that a frustration, or is that someone else, like a tier of people that are coming to you because downward no one's helping them, or upwards everybody's looking to me to have all the answers?
So I quite often work as a leader, advisor, or coach, and it's precisely that people feel lonely. They don't, they've got to present a certain image, or feel they've got to present a certain image. So you can't necessarily divulge certain things that are going on for you with other people. But even within that, I think there is still an opportunity to have a little bit more vulnerability, to sometimes acknowledge when you mess something up, or when you don't understand something. And that's actually freeing for other people, because when you do that, that message cascades down. Actually, within reason, it's okay to make mistakes.
Right.
It's okay to ask for help.
Mm-hmm.
And going back to that point about mental health, I've worked with lots of organizations that have all the resources and all the facilities to support people, but actually people don't avail themselves of it, because there's a very different message coming from the top that actually, I don't buy into these things, I don't avail myself of these things. So actually, if you want to get on this firm, you need to be more like me.
Right.
So there's that unspoken message.
Yeah, I have it. I have these resources because I have to have them from a corporate standpoint, but I don't buy into them.
Absolutely. Right. But if you take them in some way that reflects badly on you. So I think the culture that sits around it, which starts at the top, is really the glue that binds all these things together and makes them credible or not.
That's great. Listen, I love what you're talking about, and I will put the new book into the show notes as well.
Thank you.
Yeah. So as we wind down, I usually ask a few odd questions just off topic, just to know the person. So I have 3 of them for you. So the first one is, you've traveled a lot. Like you're in Cape Town, you travel. Is there a place that you haven't been yet that's on your bucket list to go spend some time?
Yeah, there's a few actually. Let me think. Where would I most want to go that I haven't been? Probably Mexico. Actually, I've never been to Mexico. No, and I don't know why, because I've been to quite a few other countries, but I'd love to go. Love Mexican food. Love history and culture. So that's definitely on my bucket list. And then probably New Zealand. And I have been to New Zealand, but only to Auckland Airport. So I changed planes between Australia and Chile.
That doesn't count.
That's as close as I've got. So that doesn't count.
That doesn't count. Great. So second, you help a lot of people. So what are you reading or watching or listening to that's inspiring you?
Interesting question. So I guess for me, it's really, again, around that, the idea of psychological safety. So I read quite a lot of Brené Brown. So this idea of leaders showing vulnerability, how that's inclusive, how it binds people together, how it's freeing as well.
Right.
How it's freeing for other people. And then alongside that, I'm also reading some things by Paul Gilbert. And Paul Gilbert talks about kindness to yourself, this idea of self-compassion.
Yes.
And a lot of us, we absorb voices from other people when we're growing up, and they drive us onto a certain level, but actually then, if we hit blockers, they then start to turn in on us. So it's something I find fascinating, both in terms of my own personal development, but also a lot of the people that I work with, they're perfectionists. Right. And that's got them so far. But again, when you hit a block, when there are things that are outside of your control, that can be really destructive. So it's really twofold, really, helping me to work on myself, but also applying some of that to the coaching that I do with people.
I like that. I was listening to a podcast, and someone was talking about that was their goal this year for themselves, is self-care, and that idea of, I have to put my oxygen mask on first at the plane, or else I can't help. I think that's great. Last question. Well, actually, I have 2. The last question around that is, so then tied to that, what's something you're personally working on for yourself that a year from now you're going to be happy that you invested the time in?
Learning to surf.
Really?
for two reasons. So I've recently relocated to Cape Town, and Cape Town's big for surfing. There's 2 reasons why I want to surf. One is because it's fun in its own right, but 2, I have a phobia of the sea. So actually, and as you probably know, Cape Town's quite infamous for its sharks.
Right.
So they're definitely around. They have shark spotters everywhere you go. So I've already started doing that, but my idea is to become really good at surfing and to get over that fear of the sea.
I love that.
Every week I go out there. The anxiety is going down a bit, but I'm still looking around me when I'm in the water. But that's my aim, is to get over that completely.
Great. All right. So I do have one last question. We've talked about a lot of things. We've touched on a lot of different, and I hope folks, go back and listen to this multiple times. And, but if there was only one thing that you hope listeners would take away from our conversation today, what would that one thing be?
I think we could have grand plans about making massive changes in our life, and I would invite people to think, what's the smallest change you could make that could have the biggest impact? And it could well be thinking about that idea of transitions. How do I manifest myself? How do I build my self-awareness in those small pockets of time that helps me to maximize my next opportunity?
Love that. Love that. Well, Richard, listen, thank you so much. This has been a pleasure, and I could chat with you for a long time. So tell people how they can find you, either on social media, your website. We'll put all of it into the show notes, but how can they contact you and reach out?
Sure. So if you're interested in having a chat, you can go to my website, which is www.richard-reid, spelled REID.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn, and again, it's Richard-Reid.
Yeah, and you write a lot. It looks almost daily on, and not just short little blurbs. You write very good posts. I do like your writing. So again, so Richard, thank you so much. Audience, you know the drill. After every episode, I ask you to make sure, number one, you share this out. I know there's someone in your network that could benefit from what Richard's talking about. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast, leave us a review, leave a comment, because I get them back to the guests, or sometimes we get good ideas to bring guests on. And if you're listening on podcast channels, don't forget to review how we're doing here. Let us know. And I appreciate you spending time with Richard and I today, because I know there is, as Richard said, there's a lot of places you can consume content, and the fact that you spend time with us means a lot. And as I say at the end of every episode, leadership is not just the title. It is the act of helping and serving others. But as Richard pointed out, it's a lot of taking care of yourself and understanding how you impact everybody, and maybe a little bit focused on your transitions and focus a little on silence, and it might make you a better leader. So we look forward to seeing you next week on the show. And again, Richard, absolute pleasure.